I had a lot of Korean friends, and sort of
okay.
slowly I decided to.
But
I think we're.
service with this.
Hello? I think we're going to get started. Tim, do you have a microphone for Kirk? Okay. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Welcome to this History and Public Policy seminar. Welcome to this North Korea International Documentation Project book launch. We're absolutely delighted to feature today Gregg Brazinsky's new book, Nation Building in South Korea. And we're delighted to start off the celebration of this important new publication. As all of you know, here at the Center, we don't just celebrate the publication of new books, even such important ones as Gregg's, but host a panel of scholars and veterans to talk about the book. So we don't just do high fives and congratulations, but hopefully a good debate about some of the findings and theses of the book. And hopefully that will involve all of you as well a bit later in the program. I should have introduced myself. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program here at the Center. This program and this event specifically is hosted by our North Korea Documentation Project, which is coordinated by my colleague James Person, who is there over to the left. It's a jointly sponsored program by the History and Public Policy program, along with two brother or sister institutes over at the Elliott School at George Washington University. That is the SIGUR Center for Asian Studies. And the director, Kirk Lawson, is here and will say a few words in a minute or two, as well as by, the event is also co-sponsored by the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Elliott School, directed by Professor Hope Harrison, to my right, who also will make some brief remarks. The Institute, Hope's Institute, also hosts the GW Cold War Group, and that group is a close partner in many of our endeavors here as part of the Cold War International History Project. Let me also acknowledge that our activities here at the Center are made possible by a grant from the Korea Foundation, and so we are delighted to have representatives of the foundation present here as well. My thanks finally should go to my staff, who has worked hard to make this event happen. James Person, I already mentioned. I should also mention Tim McDonald, all the way in the back, both of whom have worked hard on this event. Now, let me, before I introduce our main speakers, turn it over to my co-chair, Hope Harrison, and then to Kirk for some brief remarks. Hope.
All right, thank you. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be co-hosting this event. We've been looking forward to this great day and planning for it for a while. We at George Washington University in the History Department were very excited when Gregg Brazinsky joined us in January of 2002 and filled out our GW Cold War group with the whole Asia angle. He's been a crucial part of the GW Cold War group and helping with our annual Summer Institute on conducting archival research and our annual graduate student conference on the Cold War that we co-host with the London School of Economics and the University of California at Santa Barbara. Gregg is a wonderful colleague and friend, a great teacher. And I am really excited to be a part of this, excited to see so many of our colleagues from the History Department here. So thank you very much for joining us all.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. When I was approached by the North Korean Documentation Project about the possibility of co-sponsoring this event, I found myself enthusiastic and delighted, really for three separate reasons. The first is, as director of the SIGUR Center for Asian Studies, an institution devoted to increasing our understanding of Asia and its place in the world, this seems to be a very worthwhile and genuinely interesting and worthwhile topic to support. But the second is more personal. As a member of the history department at GW, and particularly one that focuses on Korea, I was delighted that of all the possible book launches to help support, Gregg's would be at the top of the list. And then finally, a lot of times, especially in this town, we find that issues of history don't attract as much attention as perhaps they might or they should. But I just wanted to conclude with the not terribly original, but I think still important to make point that South Korea is about to have presidential elections, and one of the first things on the agenda of the new president in South Korea will be the nature of the relationship between South Korea and the United States. In a year, the United States will have presidential elections, and while the U.S.-ROK alliance or the U.S.-ROK relationship won't be on nearly so high on the list of priorities, it still is an important thing for a new president to consider. But more generally, the new president will consider the United States' relations with its neighbors in Asia and across the world more generally. And as a historian, I am a firm believer that if we don't understand where we came from and how we got here, we're not really probably going to know where we should go or how to get there. And so I'm delighted to help support our understanding of this important relationship and Gregg's book. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Kirk. Thanks, Hope. Hope and I have the distinct pleasure and honor to welcome three speakers. Today, of course, Professor Gregg Brazinsky, Professor of History and International Affairs at George Washington University, and author of, again, Nation Building in South Korea, Koreans, Americans, and the Making of Democracy. Gregg has also been a senior advisor to our North Korea documentation project, so we're particularly pleased to have him here as a longtime partner and friend of the center and of the project. His presentation will be followed by two commentaries. I'm not quite sure which order should we go in. Who would like to speak first? Delaney, Bill?
I don't care.
Okay. Well, he'll be followed immediately by William Stueck, the distinguished research professor of history at the University of Georgia, and known to many of you, of course, as an eminent authority on U.S. diplomatic history, in particular American-Asian relations. He's the author of a number of important books, edited volumes, and articles, including Rethinking the Korean War, A New Diplomatic and Strategic History. We'll finally then have some comments by James Delaney, a career CIA officer and former CIA station chief in Seoul and Tokyo. Mr. Delaney is currently a consultant for the Institute for Defense Analysis and will reflect on Gregg's book in light of his own experiences in Korea in the 1980s. So with that, Gregg, you have the floor.
Thank you. I want to start out by thanking everybody for coming. Thank you to Kirk Larson and the SIGUR Center, Hope Harrison, and the Institute for European and Eurasian Studies at George Washington. Thank you, of course, to the Wilson Center, Christian, James Person, the director of the North Korea International Documentation Project, and Tim McDonnell for all of their help in putting this event together. And I want to thank Professor Stueck for coming today and for reading more drafts of this book than anyone else in the universe. And I want to thank James Delaney as well. What's the book about? In the 20th century, nation building has been a ubiquitous part of American foreign policy. During the early part of the 20th century, we tried it in the Philippines. After World War II, we tried it in Japan and Germany. And during the Cold War, we've tried it in a whole range of different places. In fact, at no point did the United States engage in nation building, these efforts to make states that are not very much like America politically, economically, and culturally look more like America politically, economically, and culturally. During the Cold War, the United States tried to carve diverse parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America into free world allies that could assist the United States in the struggle against communism. Americans believed that by providing the right kind of resources, the right kind of ideas, they could allow economic development and democratization to occur in regions where neither of these phenomenon really had made footholds before. In this book, what I do is I examine one of the most extensive, the most costly, and arguably the most successful of America's nation-building projects, South Korea. South Korea was one of the few post-colonial states, the countries to emerge from formal colonialism after World War II, to emerge as a wealthy democracy by the end of the 20th century. I try to understand why this happened and what the American role in this process was. When the Americans first occupied the southern part of Korea in 1945, the prospects for nation building there didn't look very bright. For the previous 35 years, in fact, there had been no Korea. Korea had been a Japanese colony, and moreover, Japanese imperialism had fostered deep social divisions between conservatives and liberals in Korea, and there were really few moderate liberal Democrats in the country who could be used as a base for liberal democratic nation building. Moreover, economically, during the colonial period, Japan, South Korea, North Korea, and parts of China had functioned as a closely knit economic unit. When World War II ended and the demise of Japanese imperialism, South Korea was suddenly cut off from North Korea, and the area had severe economic problems. But the United States, nevertheless, became deeply committed to nation building in this deeply troubled country and this deeply troubled area of the world by 1953. American policy had played an important role in the division of the peninsula and the creation of a separate South Korean state in the first place. Even before the Korean War occurred, when American forces occupied southern Korea and set up a military government there between 1945 and 1948, South Korea and the establishment of a stable anti-communist regime there was looked at as being key to American credibility. Of course, the loss of lives in the Korean War only amplified America's commitment to building a successful South Korean state. The loss of so many American lives during the war made South Korea's failure impossible for the United States to tolerate. Finally, Americans believed that Korea would play a key role in the Cold War because it was divided. Americans thought that this division of a single national people into separate free world and communist states, as was the case with North and South Korea, would make Korea a test case in which the relative merits of the two systems would be demonstrated to the peoples of the developing world, much as Americans believed that a divided Germany, divided into West and East, would demonstrate the relative virtues of capitalism and communism, free world versus the communist world, to the peoples of Europe. The ultimate result of all of these perceptions was that Americans began pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into South Korea with the hope of turning it into a prosperous democracy. During the late 1950s, and especially during the 1960s, South Korea received more aid from the United States, economic and military, than any other country in the world. But despite the scale of America's nation-building efforts in South Korea, they haven't received much attention from either American or Korean scholars. Very few of the American scholars who can work with Korean materials have focused on the Cold War. And in Korea itself, historians have faced state-imposed constraints, or did face state-imposed constraints into the early 90s about what they could say or write about Korea and its relationship with the United States. Moreover, the tremendous sacrifices made by Koreans seeking both to defend and challenge Cold War orthodoxies had made this a difficult subject to write about. The most relevant work, really, is Bruce Cummings' Origins of the Korean War. In an effort to show the civil origins of the war, Cummings explores the process of state formation in North and South Korea. He showed how, in the South, the United States sided with South Korean conservatives at the expense of an indigenous mass-based movement. This resulted in a highly autocratic anti-communist state that was destined for war by 1950 with its northern rivals. But Cummings' account ends with the start of the Korean War. It's a book about the origins of the war. At the time the book ends, South Korea was despotic, impoverished, and engaged in a war, the Korean War, that would only exacerbate both of these conditions. Cummings' analysis still begs the question of how South Korea got from the impoverished autocratic nation that existed at the time of the Korean War to the vibrant, prosperous democracy we know today, and of what role the United States played in this process. South Korea, in many ways, exemplified what has been one of the most bizarre ironies of the 20th century. Most of the few post-colonial states that did succeed in establishing liberal democracies by the end of the 20th century were actually countries that had been governed by autocratic governments for much of the Cold War. Some scholars, such as Fareed Zakaria, have in fact claimed that the very success of countries such as South Korea and Taiwan at consolidating democracies lies in the very fact that they did not become democracies right away. Instead, they underwent a transition, an evolution from autocracy to liberalizing or developmental autocracy to democracy. And I use the term developmental autocracy to describe what South Korea became by the 1960s. And by this I mean basically countries in where there were governments that where you had autocratic governments that maintained stability, developed the economy, and built institutions before finally surrendering power. And I think this is a fairly good description, especially of the military governments that ruled South Korea during the period from between the 1960s and the 1980s. Now, I don't mean to condone their authoritarianism. They were often brutal dictatorships whose records on human rights may never be forgiven, but they did help to spur economic development largely without popular political participation. They helped to build the middle class and create new institutions without which democracy would have been impossible. But while this idea of developmental autocracy is a good description of what happened in South Korea, it doesn't really explain why it happened. There were many autocratic governments that came to power in the post-colonial world during the years after World War II, but only a few evolved into developmental autocracies and democracies. How can you explain why this happened in South Korea? I try to do that in this book. I argue that part, but not all of the explanation has to do with what Americans did. The United States didn't seek in particular to create a developmental autocracy, and once they had one, they didn't necessarily have a concrete plan for converting it into a democracy. But the combination of policies that they chose lent themselves to this sort of evolution. In particular, throughout the Cold War, the United States was willing to support autocratic governments in South Korea that could support America's objectives, maintain security during the 1950s, and during the 1960s, promote rapid economic development. The United States again supported Syngman Rhee between 1948 and 1960s, despite his many failures, because of his strong anti-communism and because Americans trusted him to maintain security. They supported Park Chung-hee during the 1960s and 1970s because of his zealous developmentalism. Even while supporting these highly autocratic regimes, however, I argue, the United States also tried to encourage the development of new institutions in South Korea, such as schools, the media, schools and the media that could transmit discourses about democracy and development to society at large, and help to help to create a set of ideas that could at least raise the possibility for democratization in South Korea during the future. But looking at what the United States did, I argue, can really provide only a partial explanation for what happened in South Korea. The United States tried a very similar combination of support for conservative dictatorships and economic and cultural developmentalism in numerous third world countries ranging from Vietnam to Iran during the Cold War, but they did so with far less success. In fact, Odd Arne Westad has recently argued that in some 32 countries where the United States intervened, and in many of these places followed a pattern of intervention that was similar to what occurred in South Korea, there were only 2 where the United States succeeded in achieving the combination of prosperity and democracy that the United States sought to promote, with the other one being Taiwan. So, what made Korea different? I argue that it was the ways that Koreans adapted to American initiatives which were as important, if not more important, than anything Americans did. Long before American troops entered into the Korean Peninsula, Koreans had acquired hundreds, if not thousands of years of experience at adapting the philosophies and ideas of stronger, larger powers to their own needs and values. Korea had long been a Chinese tributary state and come under the influence of its Middle Kingdom neighbor, China. Koreans often had little choice but to accept hegemonic systems that were not of their own making. But while the introduction of these foreign religions and belief systems were not necessarily a product of Koreans' own choosing, Koreans nevertheless chose how to make these belief systems their own, adapting them to their own needs and values. In Korea, there is a saying, "When whales fight, the shrimp gets crushed," which is often used to describe the country's precarious geostrategic position between the great powers. In this book, I argue, though, that when it comes to negotiating the different social-cultural orders that have been placed on them, Koreans were more like dolphins that outsmarted the whales. Koreans learned how to use the dominant social orders and to deflect its power even when they lacked the means to challenge it, to paraphrase Michel Desserteau. During the Cold War, Korea's past amplified and gave direction to Korea's long-standing tendency to adapt and transform the belief systems of other dominant powers. Japanese colonialism, I argue, was especially important in this regard. Japanese colonialism had exposed Koreans to a highly authoritarian model of economic development that continued to influence them as they encountered American nation builders. The Korean conservatives in particular tended to draw on this colonial model, which sometimes meshed well with with American tolerance for autocratic governments that could ensure stability and growth. The legacy of Japanese colonialism facilitated key components of anti-communist nation building in South Korea, such as creating a military and finding a model of development that could be implemented by a strong capitalist state. At the same time, however, the colonial legacy also left Koreans with ideals about modernity that were different and in some ways much more authoritarian than those that the United States sought to introduce and that the United States could endorse as a necessary evil. The legacy of Japanese colonialism also influenced Korea's reaction to American efforts to build a democratic culture. In contrast to many other regions of the world, Korea was colonized by an Asian power, but never by a Western one. As a result, post-colonial nationalism was not as inherently anti-Western in Korea as it was in parts of the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Korean nationalists could reconcile American cultural influence with their own aspirations in ways that people in other parts of the developing world could not. Many Koreans responded enthusiastically to American efforts to build new institutions and shape new ideas. At the same time, however, Koreans were also wary of falling victims to new modes of foreign domination, and they therefore proved highly selective in appropriating American ideas about modernization and democracy, rejecting those that did not mesh with their own objectives. The horrific experiences of division and war that befell Korea after 1945 also influenced the ways that Koreans received American influence. Americans had made heroic sacrifices to prevent the fall of South Korea to communism. Moreover, the communist invasion of South Korea during the war had been brutal and violent. Throughout the Cold War, there were Koreans who remembered fighting alongside Americans, and to some extent this created an enduring pro-American image in South Korean society. Moreover, the DPRK invasion during the war created an enduring anti-communism among many sectors of the South Korean population. But the Korean War also made Koreans wary of American influence in other ways because it heightened their sense of victimization at the hands of the great power. Like the legacies of Japanese colonialism, the legacies of the Korean War made South Koreans receptive to American influence, but cautious about allowing American influence to become, cautious about not allowing American influence to become too dominant. In this book, what I try to do ultimately is look at how this combination of American nation building and Korean agency worked in tandem at a variety of different levels to create a developmental autocracy while at the same time fostering discourses about modernization and democratization among different groups in Korean society. Ultimately, by adapting a multinational, multi-archival approach to this topic, I try to show how the story of South Korea's dramatic transformation cannot be understood entirely as an American initiative or a Korean initiative, but can only be understood if it's looked at as a process of constant negotiation between the two. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Gregg. I was remiss in recognizing a couple of people. I recognize my colleague, Bob Hathaway, who directs the Asia program, with which we, of course, collaborate on many of these occasions. I should recognize via the camera here the students, some 30 high school students up in the boardroom who are watching a live cast of this presentation here. We invited them down to join us, but they were quite happy to have their teacher down here and being up there on their own. So, and last but not least, I hear that Gregg's parents are also here. I know this ought to be a moment of very much parental pride, and I want to make sure they're recognized. We're delighted to have you here. And with that, let me turn it over to Bill for an initial round of comments.
All right, thank you. This is not only a good first book, it's an excellent book, period. It is just so much more mature, sophisticated, nuanced than the vast majority of books that are published in our field. And it really is an outstanding contribution. And I feel very much pride in having read it several times and going back and forth with Gregg, and believe me, he's been very responsive. I know John Gaddis worked him over pretty well too, and he had the right attitude all along, and the product is testimony to just how long and hard he has worked on responding to an awful lot of criticism. And I do want to start by just outlining what I see to be some of the strengths of the book, but I see Leo Rebuffo is out there, and he's known me forever, and he knows that I'm not big on Love Fest. So I wanted, so I do want to argue with Gregg on some points, and I wanted the arguments focus on some of the things in the conclusion, which I hasten to add, whether you agree with them or not, in no way really diminishes from the contribution of the body of the book. So let me just start by going over a few of the things, the very positive contributions that the book represent. First, it's a history of something other than a crash landing. You know, the field, the press worldwide, I think, especially the capitalist press, tends to focus on crash landings, on bad news, and I think historians, at least in the field of American foreign policy, have a tendency to make their names on things that are crash landings. My first book was on American policy toward China and Korea, and I called it The Road to Confrontation. I mean, that's clearly it had a bad ending. You know, this does not have a bad ending, and I certainly hope he gets the recognition he deserves, despite the fact that, in a sense, he goes against the grain of what people tend to focus on in their work. Secondly, he is keenly sensitive to both sides of the bilateral relationship. He uses comfortably Korean language sources as well as American sources. He spent a good deal of time in Korea with Koreans, and it really shows in his sensitivity to the Korean side. At the same time, he does not go overboard in saying this is all Korean agency. He's very good in showing how deeply the United States penetrates Korean society. I mean, he's even got a section on the Boy Scouts and the impact on the United States on the Boy Scouts. I mean, that's a very unusual thing for a diplomatic historian to do. But, you know, in a more traditional sense, I mean, he deals very extensively with the development of the South Korean Army, especially during the 1950s, and the development of Korean academic elites, especially economists, and in doing so, he helps to explain, as no one really has as well as this before, the connection between the period from 1945 to 1960 and the period after. And this is something, by the way, that really was missing from that first manuscript that I read, which is, this had started off as a dissertation which focused really on the 1960s, and he'd just done a little bit of homework on the 45 to 60 period, and it kind of showed in the first draft. Well, he really has developed that earlier period to show the connection. It's not as if the connection is totally seamless, but it also, I think, makes a strong case that you couldn't have had the Park regime, with the successes it had, without having the development of the human infrastructure that occurred before. And it was very easy to kind of focus on the Rhee regime and the negative, very negative aspects of the Rhee regime. Rhee, after all, had absolutely no economic vision for Korea, but there were things going on behind the scenes that people didn't tend to notice at the time that were very important in setting the stage for the so-called miracle on the Han. And finally, I think, just before I get to the disagreements, the sense of nuance regarding both sides. I mean, Gregg doesn't not really seem to have any real axe to grind. He's critical of both sides. He's complimentary to both sides. It really is a nuanced, balanced book, which I think most of us, some of us don't even strive to attain, and even fewer of us succeed in attaining. Okay, enough for the love fest. Let me talk a little bit about the disagreements. And actually, I think, one of the beauties of the book is the conclusion in some ways is greater than the sum of the parts. It's not just a kind of a regurgitation of what comes earlier. It really tries to go beyond and deal with some very broad issues, and it deals with some counterfactuals, and I love counterfactuals, but at the same time, counterfactuals are almost inherently arguable, and so I want to argue with some of them. He starts out in the conclusion by posing three key questions. He says, could Korea have enjoyed the same measures of economic growth and democracy under governments that more directly reflected the popular will? Number two, were Korea's leaders more autocratic than necessary in pursuing these worthy objectives, economic development? And number three, to what extent was the United States responsible for both the successes and excesses of that is the Korean regimes. And he sees three critical junctures here. One, the period 45 to 48, one, 60-61, and then finally 1970, 79-80. And for those of you who are not expert in Korea stuff, the 45 to 48 period is, of course, the period of the American occupation, which leads to the division of the peninsula and the rise of Syngman Rhee to the presidency of the Republic of Korea, which is essentially created by the United States. The 60-61 period involves initially the overthrow of Rhee and then the coup d'etat the military coup by Park Chung-hee. And then 79-80 involves the assassination of Park and the emergence of Chun Doo-hwan through another military coup and 7 more years of military rule or developmental autocracy. And these junctures, he says, were when American actions proved vital to the assumption of autocrats at the expense of governments or political leaders who enjoyed stronger popular support. And that's a direct quote. Now, first, how do we determine what the popular will is at a given point? That's not always an easy thing to do. I think it's a fairly easy thing to do in 1960 and 1987, which is not one of his three critical points. But in 60, it was clear that the popular will wanted to be rid of Syngman Rhee. And the United States, when that became clear, not only did not oppose that, but actually helped bring it about. So on the front end of that period, the United States is actually clearly pursuing the popular will. Now in 1979, in 1987, it's clear that the popular will is against Chun Doo-hwan. They want to be rid of Chun Doo-hwan. And in that particular case, the United States helps bring it about. I emphasize helps. The primary agency was Korean, but certainly the Americans helped. In 1979 and 80, it is highly likely that the outcome, that is, the rise of another military dictator, was not consistent with the popular will. In 1961, it really is not at all clear what the popular will was, because when Park Chung-hee instituted his coup, the political leader he was trying to overthrow disappeared, went into hiding, Chiang Mai-yan. And the figurehead president, I always forget his name. Greg, can you pull it off the top of your head, the figurehead president?
Yun Po-sun?
Yes, Yun Po-sun. Actually, essentially supported the coup. And there were no significant uprisings among the South Koreans. Now, the United States did not plan the coup. The United States was not involved in the coup. But when the coup occurred, it was initially very dubious, but it rather quickly swung in and accepted it. But again, it is not clear at all what the popular will was. The democratic regime of Chiang Mai-yan had been somewhat chaotic. Economic conditions had not gotten any better. Corruption had not really been diminished much, and so the Korean people were a bit tired of it, and certainly did not take to the streets as they had in the spring of 1960 after a rigged election. Now, what about 1945? Well, what is clear about the popular will in 1945 is that it favors independence and it favors unification. It's not, much else is not clear. I would argue it's not clear. I think Bruce Cummings would argue that more is clear, that the people wanted a revolution. I mean, if I'd go as far to say as they wanted independence and unification, if that was a revolution, okay, so be it. But I think that Cummings and others have underestimated the degree to which Korea was still a very traditional society. They've also really, I think, underestimated the support that Syngman Rhee was able to develop after he returned to the country in October of 1945. Rhee was, in my mind, a very unlikable sort. And in that, I think American scholars are virtually unanimous, and the vast majority of Korean scholars, although he does have a few supporters in Korea. But he was a very astute, energetic, even at the age of 70, political operator, and much more astute than anyone else in South Korea at the time. And the Americans didn't much care for him either. But I think it would be wrong to underestimate the support that he had. But in any event, let us say, for the sake of argument, that the United States had accepted the Soviet proposal of September of 1947 for a joint withdrawal of occupation forces. Now, this was at a time when the United States was going to the United Nations General Assembly, which at the time it essentially controlled, and proposing national democratic elections supervised by a United Nations Commission. And a resolution was passed through the General Assembly in November. Well, at the end of September, right after the United States went to the General Assembly, the Soviets proposed a joint withdrawal. So let's imagine that that proposal had been accepted by the United States. Such a withdrawal, and Greg, I'd agree, we would agree on this, would have led to a civil war. And in all likelihood, unification under a leftist regime. Now, that's not necessarily to say that that would have been the result had there been no foreign intervention in 1945. I think that is much less clear. But certainly by 1947, the left was very much alive and well in the South. Of course, it was in control in the North. And I think it's really fair to say that the Civil War would have been won by the left. And the Civil War probably would have been less destructive in terms of loss of life and property than the Korean War of 1950 to 1953. It wouldn't take much to have been less destructive to Korea than the Korean War, in which some 3 million people died. Yet, a large percentage of the old elites and migrants from North Korea would have been killed or driven into exile. Kim Il-sung certainly would have emerged as the nation's leader, which I think would not have boded well for Korea's long-term future. And I think to some extent Gregg recognizes this, but I think the one thing that's kind of absent from the counterfactual analysis is the possibility that the United States had gone ahead and created essentially a separate South Korea and then not withdrawn its forces. And I think under that in 1949, when it withdrew its last forces, in 1949, had we not done that, had the United States not done that, or certainly made stronger statements and indications of a commitment to defend South Korea, you could make a strong argument, I think, that the Korean War would never have occurred. So I think it's very important when playing with alternative histories not to at least consider the possibility of a divided Korea, perpetually divided Korea without a Korean War. And I think that although obviously the division of Korea was not ideal, there's something to be said for a divided Korea if it meant non-control of the South by Kim Il-sung. Now, further, if we're going to jump to the 1960s here, Gregg argues that in 1960-61, the United States supported autocracy at the expense of democracy. Now, I didn't go back and reread the whole body of your book, but my recollection is really that the way you deal with that period in the body of your book really is not consistent with that statement. Because I think Gregg recognizes, as certainly I do, that the United States was really quite aggressive with Park Chung-hee in the early years in, number one, pushing him to end his military government, and number two, hold free elections, both of which he did in 1963. And he won a very closely contested election, which most people said, by and large, was fair in 1963. Now, he didn't like it. He was not, in love with the Americans by any stretch of the imagination, but he submitted to American pressure. And I think it's very important, really, to kind of understand the difference between the 1960s and the 1970s when we're looking at American policy and the Park regime. So I really don't think it's fair to say, initially at least, that the United States supported autocracy at the expense of democracy. And then, finally, if we can jump to the 1979-80 period, Gregg argues, and again this is a direct quote, the United States' decision to support Chun Doo-hwan, albeit reluctantly, left a lasting scar on American relations with South Korea and remains a source of tension between the two countries to this day. Now, I can't disagree with that, but I would just like to throw out a cautionary here, and that is, it's not clear that there were viable alternatives at that time, because Chun Doo-hwan in December of 1979, 6 weeks or so after the assassination of Park, had seized control of the army in what is referred to in Korea as the 12-12 incident. And once that happened, as Jim said to me earlier, Chun was riding the tiger. That is to say, he pretty much had to stay on top, or he was in deep doo-doo, or maybe even 6 feet under, or in exile. And if the United States, now the United States didn't anticipate the 12-12 incident. Once it had occurred, it would have been very, very difficult to have done anything to have prevented him from ultimately taking over. Now, I would be the first one to concede that 1980 and early 1981 are not part of America's best moment in international politics or in American relations with Korea. But it essentially one could argue, did what was necessary. It made peace with the Chun regime and began preparing for 7 years later. In other words, for the end of the generous 7-year term that Chun Doo-hwan bestowed upon himself. And in 1987, in actually the lead-up, starting in the fall of 1986, the United States was really quite aggressive in trying to make damn sure that what had happened in 1979-80 did not repeat itself. Now, it kind of in conclusion, I guess the thing that makes me a little bit uneasy about parts of Gregg's conclusion is that history is messy. Processes of change are rarely, linear, seamless, without cost. He's right. We wish the Americans in certain circumstances had done better. Certainly the South Koreans, many South Koreans, especially of the generation in their 40s now, have never forgiven us for not doing better in Gwangju and, for welcoming Chun as the first Asian president to visit Reagan in the White House in 1981. But, in fact, that visit probably saved Kim Dae-jung's life. And that was a very good thing. That was a trade-off, and things worked out well in the end. We can't expect them to have been perfect along the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Mr. Delaney?
Yeah, thank you. Anybody out there who knows me knows that I can't do a discussion at this academic level. I think both Gregg and Bill have provided second-to-none context for guys like me who will now maybe share a few war stories with you based on personal experiences with Chun and his administration when I served as station chief. I'm a kind of made-in-Korea guy. 2 of my daughters married U.S. Service people, or met their husbands, married them later while they accompanied me to Korea. The suit I wear was made in Korea. The watch I'm wearing was given to me by outgoing Korean Defense Minister Yoon. What else? A whole bunch of things like that. I've been in this Korean thing since the Korean War. I served in the Korean War as a CI paramilitary officer from 52 to 53 when the war had settled down. As I say, both the book and Bill's comments provide some great context for what will hopefully be of interest to you in the way of my brief comments. I would say the single most defining breakthrough in nation building in Korea occurred in June of '87, when Gaston SIGUR and then the Assistant Secretary of State and Ambassador Jim Lilly demarched Chun Doo-hwan on 2 important items. One was convincing him to step down when his term ended, and secondly, that the election of the next president should be direct rather than in that Mickey Mouse way that Chun had gotten himself elected. Now, a little known but very successful and defining intervention that occurred long before that was when, in the 70s, Undersecretary Phil Habib closed the door with Park Chung-hee and confronted him over his very ambitious and secret nuclear weapons program. There were many in the State Department and Ambassador Dick Snyder at the time who felt this was necessary, but who also felt that this would cause serious problems in the relationship. If anything, the Koreans came away with more respect for us for having discovered that and for having demarched them and put an end to what would have destabilized the entire region. I thought in commenting on my experiences during the Chun administration, Well, the first insight I had into Chun, and this is a reminder that women have the best instincts about men. That I can remember when Tom Hubbard's term was coming to an end in Korea, and the White House and State Department were looking for a successor. And so they asked me and a bunch of people for our advice. I said, hold a war game on Korea. Invite all of the potential candidates and smart people on Korea, but include at least 2 very bright women on Asian affairs. In about 20 minutes into this war game, have someone rush in and say, the building's on fire, and then see who the women turn to get them out. That's your next ambassador to Korea. Because that's the kind of guy who can handle the sometimes very contentious relationship with the U.S. military, with a 4-star out there. I saw that during the term of Dixie Walker. Anyway, my first insight into Chun came from a secretary who had served in the CIA station in Korea during the Park Chung-hee period, and at the time had been teaching English to Lieutenant Colonel Chun Do-won, who was assigned to the security detail in the Blue House. She taught English to him once a week. As I was leaving for Seoul in August of '83, she came in now this gal was a sky jumper, by the way, and a great dancer. She said, I knew that guy would become president, because any time there was a dust-up in the Blue House, all the senior people would turn to him to take over for that temporary period. And and that's certainly that bird's eye view of Chun turned out to be true. I thought I'd describe Chun under the heading of 4 in his operational style under 4 incidents: the shoot down of the Korean airliner, the Rangoon bombing, the Reagan visit. All of these, by the way, occurred within a few weeks or in the fall of '83. And then Chun's panicky overreaction to the invitation to Kim Dae-jung and YS to, for the first time, to attend the 4th of July national U.S. Reception at Dixie Walker's place. On the day of the shoot down, at about 6 o'clock, I was getting in 9 holes of golf at Yongsan with, coincidentally, the KCIA guy who was in charge of security at Kimpo Airport. After about 3 holes, he disappeared without saying anything. Then, as I got to the office, of course, the media was full of reports that the Korean airliner was overdue. And there was widespread speculation and hope that it had landed safely on Sakhalin. 10 minutes later, I received from NSA incontrovertible evidence that the Soviets had shot down the Korean airliner. And that evidence was in the form of oral communications between the pilot and his ground control people. And the pilot gloating that he's blown the goddamn thing out of the air. Against the wishes of Dixie Walker and General Sennewald, I insisted that we tell the Korean government right away, rather than go to Washington. It would have taken 3 weeks for Washington to decide, whether and when. And by then, the Koreans would know that we had withheld that important information from them. So I got permission to pick up the phone and call the deputy director of the KCIA. Actually, then it was called the National Security Bureau, Park Se-jik. I said, I have terrible news, and I conveyed it to him. And I had a couple of people in my office as witnesses. 20 minutes later, Park held a press conference saying, my good friend Jim Delaney has told me that the plane has landed safely on Sakhalin. So when I asked him about this afterwards, I said, why did you do this? He said, Jim, Kimpo Airport was in disarray. The relatives of the people on the plane had taken over. We needed to put something out there that would calm them down so that we could regain control of the airport. That's the way that the Chun Do-won regime handled the shoot-down of the KAL airliner. The Rangoon bombing. Simultaneously with the occurrence of that bombing, I was in the office of that same Pak Se-jik at the Imandong campus of the KCIA. We were changing our clothes to prepare to play tennis out there with Park and the head of the Defense Security Command. Now, Peter and others, Korean hands here, know what the Defense Security Command. It's kind of like, well, the Internal Affairs Bureau of the Korean military. Very powerful. As we were changing our clothes, a young aide rushed in with a cable from Rangoon, and it read like this: "There has been a bombing. President Chun is safe. Foreign Minister Lee Bum-suk, Deputy Prime Minister So Suk-jun, and a whole host of other people had been killed. General Lee Ki-baek is in serious condition and is being treated in a Burmese hospital." Believe it or not, the two Parks continue changing their clothes to go out and play tennis. I said, this is a goddamn national emergency. I have to find the ambassador. I have to tell General Senowon we have to report to Washington. And you two guys better get ready, because Chun is going to cancel the rest of his diplomatic tour, come back here this evening, call each of you in separately, and give you instructions. I don't know what they were. Sure enough, Chun returned in 5 or 6 hours, called Park Se-jik, the KCIA deputy, in. You're going to Rangoon to lead the investigation. He called Park Jun-byung, the head of the DSC, in and said, you're going to investigate the KCIA. They may have been behind this. Now, why did he think the KCIA may have been behind this? Because the whole diplomatic trip that was supposed to start in Burma and go on to India and Africa was conceived by the then director of the KCIA, No Shin-yong, who had ambitions of his own to succeed Chun. So I'm speculating now, but I think Chun's feeling that the KCIA needed to be investigated about this came from the insistence that No Shin-yong had been about Chun making this tour against the objections of everybody else in the cabinet and in the Blue House. Anyway, so much for the Rangoon shoot-down. The Reagan visit. The Reagan visit was planned for over a year, meticulously. I have never seen anything planned in such detail. About 4 days before the Reagan visit was scheduled, Reagan was scheduled to arrive, I received an eyes-only immediate message from CIA Director Bill Casey. Okay, Delaney, let me tell you something. Unless you can guarantee the absolute safety of President Reagan, his trip to Seoul and Tokyo is going to be canceled. I don't know how many of you remember, a couple of days before that, Reagan had been playing golf at Augusta National Golf Course, and a redneck, unemployed steelworker had taken over the clubhouse and held everybody in the clubhouse hostage while Reagan was out on the course and the Secret Service were mulling around trying to solve that. Nancy took this as a premonition and convinced everybody in the White. No, I was so embarrassed about this in the White House in Casey that it was a premonition that something terrible would happen to Ronald Reagan when he got to Seoul or Tokyo. Just as I was reading this, Dixie Walker, the ambassador, walked into my office looking very pleased at what he had done to prepare for the visit. When I showed him this message, he just blanched. He said, Jim, God damn it, you have to tell Casey that if this visit is canceled, we'll lose our credibility throughout the region, for canceling the visit on such flimsy reasons. I said, Dixie, if I say that, they'll say, we're sacrificing the president's safety for political reasons. I said, Dixie, the one advantage of being in an authoritarian state is that they've got total control, or near total control. I have no trouble saying, well, I can guarantee virtually absolute security and safety for the president. And I ticked up the reasons. And I put in a PS and I said, because in this kind of a country where all the security services are centralized, unlike in the U.S. where they're decentralized and don't talk to one another, you've got a much better chance of security and safety. So anyway, the visit came off. But I thought I'd share that story with you. The last one I'll touch on is the Chun's panicky overreaction to the invitation to YS and DJ to attend the 4th of July celebration in July of '86. This led to a series of démarches by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister on Dixie, like 2 or 3 a day. Saying the worst kind of things, predicting that the North Koreans would use this to take over South Korea, saying we would be betraying them, and so on and so forth. Morta Bramwitz happened to be in Korea at that time and accompanied Dixie to a couple of those unfortunate démarches. That put the CIA station chief, namely me, in the position of trying to do some damage control. And it wasn't because I was such a hotshot, but because my counterpart, Chang Se-dong, the then head of the KCIA, was the only person who could speak up to Chun, who could make decisions on his own. And by the way, both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister told Dixie that no government officials, no members of the National Assembly, nobody of any consequence would come to that reception if we didn't withdraw those invitations. So I went to see Chang, and I said, you know better than I do that this situation's out of control. You and I have to do damage control. And I said, damage control has to include you using your power to make sure of the greatest attendance ever at this reception, and that you get there first and be there to greet the 2 Kims. Well, not because I said it, but because he realized that he was the only person who could settle things down. He did that, and he was indeed one of the first guys there and one of the first people other than the ambassador to shake hands with Kim Dae-jung and Kim Yong-sam. Anyway, that's my contribution. I'm sorry for lowering the level of the discussion here, but I thought I'd share. These things I think illuminate. And the last thing I'll add is that throughout this period, whenever for example, during the Rangoon bombing, the threat from North Korea never figured into Chun's calculations. It was all about domestic politics. North Korea was the Americans' problem. I sat in with General Sennewald in the bunker with all the heads of the Korean military, and there was never any talk of retaliation against North Korea by the South Koreans. And Washington didn't believe that, so they sent Weinberger, Rich Armitage, the Deputy Secretary of State, General Wickham, the Chief of Staff of the Army, immediately to Korea, ostensibly to console the Koreans over the bombing, but actually to discourage them from retaliating, which was never in the cards. The only conversation when the Koreans met to discuss it was, this is the Americans' problem. We have too much to lose by retaliating against North Korea. Anyway, thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. I know Gregg's burning to respond to some of these comments, but I do want to bring all of you into the conversation here. So why don't we take Gregg, and the other panelists, if you allow me to proceed this way, take a couple of questions and then give all of the panelists a chance, in particular, of course, Gregg, a chance to respond. If you could please wait for the microphone. This event is being webcast live, and I know when we don't wait for the microphone, I'll be getting a bunch of emails from our listeners overseas. So who's got the first question or comment? Yes, up here. And if you could please identify yourself as well.
Mike Choi with ITA. Professor Brazinsky, I guess I'm wondering, Korea, particularly their Ministry of Tourism, likes to extol the fact that Korea has a 5,000-year history, and the title of your book is Nation Building. I guess, in any point of your research, was there any kind of commentary by the Koreans on this relationship with the U.S., as U.S. is heavily investing within Korea and providing lots of guidance in terms of their economy and politics, whether directly or indirectly? Did they feel like, well, we have a 5,000-year history, but here is the United States with, I guess, less than 300 years of history. Was there any kind of like disconnect in terms of your research or any kind of feelings on this?
Thank you. We'll take one more question up here. Professor Schwabe.
Thank you. I found this discussion very enlightening and also vindicating, because I have to refer to an experience I had I think, in this place a year and a half ago. I have a little study, a comparative discussion of various methods of nation building, and I mentioned Korea as one of the success stories. Not too many of them, but this I thought was one. Well, afterwards, a Korean student came up to me and complained and said, "We never have been a nation, or we haven't been a nation until 87, as you said. Before that was a dictatorship with which we didn't want to have anything to do." Now, I'm afraid I blushed because I'm not an expert on domestic politics of Korea, and I tried to defend myself. Of course, it's a question of definition, but it was very rough to disentangle me, I must say, and get to the reception. Well, the problem that's the problem that comes up is there was American guidance. There was American interference in a country we just learned that's 5,000 years old. The thing I find intriguing with the American effort at nation building is this tightrope walk, between influencing, exercising clout, and still creating the feeling that the people in question is not imposed on, In other words, that the Koreans at one point identified themselves with that new nation. And my question is, what the specific, according to your research, the specific American methods were in this tightrope act, if I have been able to explain myself.
Thank you. Gregg?
Okay, a few things. Mike Trez's question I thought was good on a few different levels. First of all, you said, I actually thought you were going to go in a slightly different direction when you said, well, Korea has a 5,000-year-old history. How can you talk about nation building in a country that's 5,000 years old? And, in the book, I tend to look at nation building a lot in the ways that Americans talked about it, in the ways that Americans defined it. And there's a lot of different definitions, but for Americans, it generally meant the creation of a stable, liberal capitalist democracy. Now, there's a lot of other ways to define it, but you eventually asked, well, do Koreans who have this long history, what do they think about the United States trying to impose this, new system of ideals and values on them? And I think one of the interesting things I find in my research, and that I talk about in more detail in the chapters, is that Koreans didn't necessarily see this as inconsistent. Throughout their history, they've sort of adapted new kinds of belief systems, Buddhism, Confucianism, and so, part of my argument is one of the reasons it was able to succeed is because if you look at Korean history and what it actually is, it had a history and culture which set it up well for liberal capitalist nation building. The second question, I think when Koreans say they don't have a nation until 1987, knowing Koreans, I think it's more likely that they said they don't have a democracy until 1987. I think they would probably say they had a nation for 5,000 years. What were the specific American methods? And again, I talk about that in a lot of detail in the book. I talk about the kinds of governments they supported, but I also pay a lot of attention to what the United States was doing at the social and cultural level and institutional level, building military, building schools, efforts to disseminate ideas about democracy and modernity among intellectuals. I think all of those were important. And I also tend to see I think there's a tendency among, especially among the Korean left, to look at Korea's democratization very ahistorically. 1987, poof, suddenly there's democracy. And what happened in the previous 30 years and what the United States did during these years have nothing to do with this. This book is really, it tries to be corrective to that. And sort of, but that's one criticism I expect. Bill Stueck's criticism sort of came in the other direction. Did I give Americans enough credit, given the very difficult choices that they had? Did Americans, did American actions really count? Were American actions really counter to Korea, to the popular will of Koreans? Some of those questions are really difficult and complicated because it is really difficult to sort out, what did the typical Korean think in these different historical junctures. You have to work with the material that you have, and also to a certain extent by comparing Korea to other places. I think between 45 and 48. I do agree to some extent that the right and that there were conservative nationalists in Korea and that they had more legitimacy, more popularity, and were more credible than people like Bruce Cummings has given them credit for. But where I would still tend to agree with Cummings' line of thinking is that I do think if you look at the balance of what more newspapers were saying, what American reporting on Korean popular sentiment in 45 to 48 was, there seem more indications that the left was more popular. 60 to 61, it's even more complicated, where I say that the United States promoted democracy where the United States promoted autocracy at the expense of democracy and the popular will. This is also tricky. What was the popular will then? I think I would argue that if you asked Koreans on May 15th, 1961, do you want to continue with the democratic government or do you want to see a military coup tomorrow? They would mostly say, the majority would say they would prefer to continue with the democratic government despite the flaws of Chang Myeon's government. And I do criticize it. And I do say that continuing to support Chang Myeon might not have been, if they had done so, things might not have worked out any better than they actually did, and in fact probably would have worked out worse. And I'm getting criticism from the left on that because, it comes across that I'm sort of legitimating American support for authoritarianism. I think, though, as history progresses, the fact that these authoritarian dictatorships ran counter to Korean popular will, I think that becomes clearer and clearer, and I think the alternatives that exist become more and more realistic. I think especially by 79, where you had a generation of South Korean democratic leaders, people like Kim Young-sam and people such as Kim Dae-jung, they were already in a position where they gained power, a decade and a half later, and these same people were very competent, very efficient governors of, presidents and leaders of Korea. So, I would think they could have been in 1980 to 1981. And James Delaney, I thank you a lot for your comments. I think you're one of the people I definitely should have done an oral history interview with because my last chapter I really had only like a smattering of materials that have come off on the 80s. And so it's not really colorful, and so I would have really had a much more colorful chapter. But a few of the things that you said were interesting. For instance, you talk about how the CIA invited, or how Kim Young-sam and Kim Dae-jung were invited to this celebration. I talk about in the chapter how, in the last chapter, how the United States this was part of a broader strategy to sort of cultivate democratic elites during the 1980s and make sure that, the U.S. could try to have it both ways. They could support Chun Doo-hwan and authoritarianism, but at the same time they could try to make sure that when these democratic leaders gain power eventually, they wouldn't be anti-American. Also, you'd say, I mean, your perspective is also interesting because the point you made about how there was no talk of retaliation in the South Korean government after the Rangoon incident is surprising, because every American document that I've read about it, the perspective in those documents is we've got to go over there immediately because the South Koreans are thinking about retaliating. And so hearing that from you is actually extremely interesting, and it forced me to rethink another thing that I'm working on. So,
Thank you.
Can I say something briefly?
Sure.
About
Into the microphone, though. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Your question about how comfortable are Koreans with receiving American guidance, and maybe it's too stifling. It's my experience that the very same Koreans who feel uncomfortable about that are the first ones to play the American card and seek an high-level American contact when whatever their plans and ambitions are requires something that they need to beat down their Korean opponents. So the Americans in those cases find themselves caught right in the middle. I mean, we are not very good imperialists, and but I mean there are so many cases of this, and they're very illuminating.
Thank you. We have time for just a couple more questions. There's the gentleman all the way in the back who's waiting, and then we'll go to you.
Bruce Bechtel with the Marine Corps Command and Staff College. And I just bought your book, and congratulations on its publication, and I hope you'll sign it for me afterwards.
There'll be an opportunity, yep.
And also, congratulations on a great panel. It's great to see Kristen Osterman again, especially. My question is, I looked, as I was trying to listen to you and the other distinguished panelists speak, I was also trying to read through your book on the Gwangju incident. And the reason I ask you that is at my class, required reading for my students is Wickham's book on the Gwangju uprising and the 12/12 incident. And I didn't see it in your bibliography. And so my question is, was there a reason that I mean, did you talk to General Wickham or did you read the book? And if so, how is his spin on what happened, being the sink at the time? How is his different from yours?
Okay, thank you. And up front here.
I'm Peter Beck with the U.S. Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. I have a quick question for Jim. And in your stories about Chun Doo-hwan, I'm still not sure if you positively or negatively assessed him based on how he reacted to each of these incidents that you described. I'm just curious about your assessment. But I guess more broadly, as a student of this period, perhaps I came in with overly high expectations, but I have to confess that in your presentation at least, I didn't learn any new information or insights into this period. In fact, your assessment of putting the greatest emphasis on the U.S. and South Korean adaptability, I would actually point to an even more important factor, and that's Park Chung-hee himself. That without Park Chung-hee, that we wouldn't be having this discussion today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Greg?
On the did I use Wickham's book? I'm actually embarrassed to say I'm not sure that I've seen that one. I do feel that I've tried to incorporate his perspective and American policy perspective. I used a lot of the other autobiographies that were available from the 80s, and I used a lot of primary source documents from the 1980s. So I'm not sure why that didn't find its way into the bibliography. In terms of Peter's question, or his point that was Park Chung-hee the most important? I mean, it's sort of a different view of history that I have. It's sort of the great man theory of history that it's individuals that are important. And in the book I do say I do underscore Park Chung-hee's importance, and I do say that if you didn't have I do say that the kind of government that he built was without that you couldn't have had the rapid economic development of the 1960s and 1970s. But I also in the book try to situate Park Chung-hee, his ideology, what he tried to do within the broader context of the South Korean military and how they had come to think, especially by the late 1950s, because Park Chung-hee wasn't the only person in the military who had this zealous developmentalism. So, you know, could another person have come out of the same background is an interesting historical question, and one which is really very difficult to answer. You know, you know, how important is an individual actor? How important were the creations of the prerequisite ideas and institutions? It's really hard to fully assess that, I would say. But I do try in the book to give Park Chung-hee his due. He's on the cover.
Thank you. Bill, you had a
let me just
final
make
comment? Yeah.
a couple of responses on the Wickham book. You know, I think that's, even though, I mean, he stresses the security factor and the need to protect against North Korea. I frankly think that that's the weakest of the memoirs of that period. And I think, even though I have certain disagreements with the memoir of Jim Young, who was the assistant military attaché at the time, whose memoir I edited, you know, I think that there's more kind of penetration of the situation by Young than there is by Wickham. And certainly Glaystein's work is a better book, I think, than Wickham's, and a good deal more honest, frankly. The second point, I like Peter's point, and this kind of leads into my third point in terms of contrasting Gregg's and my perspectives a little bit. I've basically made a career out of analyzing decision making, and in the field of diplomatic history in recent years, there's been a somewhat of a shift. Not that decision making is out of fashion, but there's been a lot more attention devoted to broad kind of cultural analysis and analysis of cultural policies, cultural diplomacy, and so forth and so on. And I think that tends, and Gregg's approach here is far, far better in my mind than the vast majority of people who work in that genre. But there still is in that approach a tendency perhaps not to be quite as keenly sensitive to specific situations. Now, you could argue that the fallacy in my approach is I'm too, you know, dug into specific situations. So there is a trade-off. But with Park, I think you're right. He probably was the indispensable man, but without the infrastructure that Gregg talks about that had developed during the 50s, the expertise, the human development, really, there I don't think would have been the kind of opportunity that Park made the best of.
Thank you. Well, I have to bring this session to an end. It was a very rich presentation and discussion. I took away a lot of things, including that Korea is a hard place to get a good game of golf in. Many other things. I'd like to, on behalf of my co-organizers, Hope Harrison and Kirk Larson, also congratulate Gregg on this wonderful accomplishment. Thank you and the other panelists for their comments and questions, and invite you to a glass of wine and some nibbles outside. And books will be available at a discount, and I'm sure Gregg would be delighted to sign them.